Like most other countries, Mexico is under assault by the three trends that will make up the New World: shifting trade patterns, inverting demographics, and spasming energy patterns. In Mexico's case, the resultant changes are almost completely positive, but there is still a dark side, and it will not be contained within Mexico's borders. Mexican geography is wretched. From an economic and political point of view, the country is far more fractured than even what the Canadians have had to contend with. Mexico has no navigable rivers whatsoever. Much of its territory is fully tropical or hard desert. Worse, nearly all of Mexico, whether temperate, jungle, or desert, is mountainous as well. Jungles are the worst biome from an economic development point of view. The unrelenting heat and humidity of jungle territories provides an endless array of biological diversity, including an endless array of diseases and disease vectors. The seasonal frosts and freezes of temperate climes not only inhibit the spreads of various pathogens, but also tend to kill off the insects that carry them. People living in the tropics have no such luck. High heat and humidity exacts a constant toll on infrastructure from roads to buildings. Maintenance costs tend toward the extreme because builders must choose between having to replace everything more often or using different and more expensive materials in construction. Then there is the simple fact that the basic technologies of modern road building, the use of heavy machinery and the drying of concrete, are rather hard to manage in a downpour. Asphalt softens on a hot day, and the tropics have hot to spare. Tropical soils are very thin and shallow, only retaining their fertility when they are part of a natural biome. That fertility comes from the constant recycling of a jungle's myriad plant species, and the process of clearing land for agriculture guts the cycle. Former jungles and rainforest lands, therefore, require constant fertilization to maintain agricultural production, even for tropical crops like bananas and yams. And if surrounding jungle lands are not cleared as well, then heavy pesticide use is a must, raising costs further, even as water quality declines. Often the tropics boast higher annual production totals per acre than temperate climes, because the heat and sun of the tropics frequently support more than one crop cycle a year. But that increased output comes at the cost of radically increased inputs. So more foodstuffs, yes, but the overall production is generally among the least efficient in the world. There are very few places on Earth where those farming the former jungle are not mired in poverty, and Mexico is no exception. Counteracting the effects of its tropical climate is Mexico's first challenge. The Mexicans addressed this by going uphill. Higher elevation mitigates heat and humidity, soil fertility has higher potential, and the cooler temperatures and thinner air work against diseases and their vectors. Most of Mexico's population, and all but 4 of its major cities, are nestled in the multitude of plateaus, highland basins, and mountain valleys throughout the country's midsection, where the elevation lifts the land out of the tropics into a more temperate environment. But that simply replaces the tropical challenge with a mountain challenge. Mountains, by definition, don't sport large tracts of flat land. There is no Mexican equivalent of the American Midwest that has the ability to generate scads of capital or support massive populations. Unlike other locations in North America, not one Mexican urban region has a hinterland. Chicago and St. Louis have the entire Midwest, New York City the Hudson Valley and Long Island, Orlando all of Central Florida, and the cities of the coastal southeast can draw upon the Piedmont. But when one leaves Mexico's highland valleys, one either hits deserts or jungles or mountains, or more likely, mountainous desert or mountainous jungle. Each mountain valley is limited in size and is more or less on its own. Any infrastructure that benefits one region cannot be extended to synergize with another. It must be rebuilt in each and every region without contributing to a greater whole. Mexico isn't split into 5 sections like Canada, but instead dozens, most of which cannot independently generate meaningful economies of scale. By far, Mexico's largest highland enclave is the greater Mexico City metropolitan area, home to 1 in 5 Mexicans and built on landfill. It isn't so much a good location as it is the best that the Mexican geography has on offer. Beyond Mexico City, only 10 Mexican metro areas pass the 1 million mark, break 5 million. The United States has 10. The economies of scale, abundant capital, and ease of development that the Americans take for granted and that make industrialization possible are all absent in Mexico. Transport, always the difficulty of the human condition, is more onerous in mountains than in any other terrain. Sharp elevation changes generate swift currents, meaning that not one of Mexico's rivers is navigable, naturally or otherwise. The Mexico core region of Mexico City sits at an elevation of about 8,000 feet, despite being only 200 miles inland. In comparison, Minneapolis sits at only 1/10 the elevation despite being 7 times the distance inland. Even when Mexico's disassociated regions manage to construct some local infrastructure, links between those regions require tackling topographic verticality that is painfully daunting not just to build but also to operate. Organic consumption growth is nearly impossible because what little capital there is must be dedicated to infrastructure. But even then, basic internal distribution is nearly impossible because of the extreme operating costs. It is a recipe for disconnected poverty and fractured, ineffectual government. Such difficult terrain skews what development that can happen into decidedly inegalitarian directions. In Mexico, the only people who can make a serious go are those who already have capital to spare. Those who could afford to build the expensive road and rail necessary to link a middling patch of useful land to the coast. Those who could afford to pay workers for months or even years to clear and fertilize land so that it might one day support crops. Most Mexican territory requires irrigation, further increasing the gap between those with capital and those without. Even the climate works against economic liberty. Tropical plantation crops like bananas and coffee require a great deal of capital to establish and a mammoth amount of unskilled labor throughout the crop's life cycles to tend, harvest, and ship. In comparison, temperate crops such as wheat, barley, and corn require little labor between planting and harvest, and the actual harvesting process is fairly light on labor. You can machine harvest or even scythe and thresh in pre-industrial times, a field of wheat in a very short period of time, but each bunch of bananas has to be harvested and carefully stored by hand. When an oligarch uses his money to build a road and a plantation and maybe even a port, that oligarch finds himself quite literally the ruler of all he sees. He has applied his wealth to make something out of nothing, and he is well aware that no one who works for him could have possibly done the same. He has little interest in sharing his investments with anyone else, even another oligarch. To do so would dilute the absolute economic and political power that he holds in his own personal fiefdom. Perhaps Mexico's biggest tragedy is that when, against very expensive odds, someone does manage to make a portion of Mexico functional, that someone has every interest in resisting contributing to a broader regional or national effort to replicate the success. To do so would jeopardize not only control over the sunk investment, but also the privileged economic and political position that comes with it. Whereas the United States was settled by the poor who became rich, Mexico was settled by the rich who commanded, and still command, the poor. These factors, low capital generation from a lack of cheap transport, high capital demand from infrastructure, limited land due to topography, a political and economic system geared towards regional jefes and their plantations, sharply limit the ability of the country to urbanize, much less industrialize. Mexico's capital scarcity and extreme capital needs mean that much of the money that will be used for infrastructure development will have to come from foreign sources. And in a quick logic chain threading from geography to population patterns to transport needs to debt markets, you now understand how Mexico's regular bouts of debt crisis are both endemic and inevitable. And then there is its government. Meaningful central authority has a prerequisite: the ability to reach all portions of the territory. Not only is that far from a given in Mexico, but much of what transport infrastructure exists is beholden to the needs of the oligarchs. Its use is not automatically available to the government. Making matters worse, the oligarchs have tended to develop the most useful patches of land. In Mexico's too dry mountainous north or its too wet mountainous south, there is little of economic interest and thus little oligarch activity and little infrastructure. Upwards of half of Mexican territory, concentrated in the far north and far south, exists in a sort of Hobbesian limbo, where anyone who wishes to exert sufficient resources can make his will a temporary reality. Mexico's borderlands are zones so lightly populated that local authorities cannot police them, and they have so little infrastructure that national authorities cannot reach them on a meaningful timescale. Even in periods of plenty, these areas will always be insufficiently patrolled and so will always be smuggling zones and can never be secured in the way that Americans define the term. In essence, Mexico lacks the geographic characteristics to be a successful state. Geography condemns it to be home to a poor, drastically unequal, underdeveloped society riven by regional and class-based cleavages that no degree of local investment or understanding can ever heal. The only other significant country in the world that was dealt as bad a geographic hand as Mexico is perhaps Afghanistan. If not for a few lucky oil discoveries around 1900, Mexico would have likely faded into oblivion, long ago. But as wretched as Mexico seems from time to time, no serious observer would say that it is even remotely as bad as Afghanistan. The reason for that is quite simple. It is next to the United States, the global consuming superpower. Somewhat ironically, Mexico's weakness has become the key factor in ensuring its success. The sheer difference between the two countries' topographies, America's capital richness versus Mexico's capital poverty, America's ease of development versus Mexico's constant struggle, ensures that Mexican labor will always be both cheap and underutilized, making Mexican labor perennially attractive to anyone wanting to service America's nearly bottomless demand. In that differential lies the core of Mexico's economic success. In the next couple of decades, a shift of circumstances will turn Mexico from the United States' extremely junior partner to something significantly more. 4 factors are at work. 1. Chinese labor costs have skyrocketed. No country lost out to China's emergence onto the international scene as much as Mexico. Prior to China's joining the WTO in 2001, Mexico was the primary source of textiles and low-end manufactured goods to the United States. Despite China's many internal weaknesses, its ability to subsidize its inputs and outputs and marry them to low-cost labor in an environment of centralized political control allowed it to undercut countries like Mexico that relied on mid-cost labor and proximity. But those days are over. Leaving aside the issues of China's political stability, or lack thereof, ability to continue subsidizing its output, or lack thereof, and ability to manipulate the international economic system, or lack thereof, it has simply run out of cheap labor. Since 2002, Chinese labor has increased in cost by a factor of 6 to about $3 per hour. In relative terms, Chinese labor has increased from being 1/4 as expensive as Mexican labor to 1/4 more expensive. Considering that Mexico already has far superior transport access to the United States, and that there is a decades-old tradition of collaboration between American management and Mexican oligarchs, the numbers certainly are positioned for a labor cost-driven onshoring to Mexico. 2. American shale is supercharging the Mexican electricity system. Due to shale, the Americans have a massive glut in their natural gas system. Unlike crude oil, natural gas is, well, a gas, and the transportation of gases is difficult. There are only 2 means of getting it out of a supersaturated market. The first is to cool it into a liquid about minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit, and then ship it to someone who has the infrastructure capacity to safely return it to gaseous form. This liquefied natural gas, LNG, process is the only way to ship the stuff across an ocean. However, there are also many regulatory steps involved, and as recent energy politics in the United States have amply demonstrated, gaining national approval for a transnational energy infrastructure project is somewhat difficult, not to mention that freezing natural gas into liquid form is as expensive as it sounds. While dozens of projects have applied for regulatory approval, only a small handful have achieved the necessary permits at the local, state, and national levels, and construction has only begun on one. Cheniere's Sabine Pass facility began construction in 2013 and is expected to begin operations in 2016. That leaves a lot of shale natural gas stranded in the American interior, practically begging for a market. But one of the great open secrets of the American energy complex is that it is already legal to export natural gas so long as it is by pipe and so long as it goes to Mexico. As of the beginning of the shale boom, there were already 9 natural gas pipelines crossing the border, supplying Mexico with nearly 1/4 of its natural gas needs, about 1 billion cubic feet per day. BCFD. Since the shale boom, however, work has begun on 3 major corridors as well as expansions throughout the export system in order to marry the ultra-cheap American natural gas to the Mexican power network and labor market. Exports doubled to 2 BCFD between 2010 and 2013, but the real growth will come in 2016. At that point, several new trunk lines will begin operation, allowing the export of U.S. energy to heretofore unreached Mexican regions up to and including the Mexico City core. Mexican imports from the United States are expected to hit 10 times their 2010 levels. Nearly all of that natural gas is planned to be used for electricity generation. Chinese competition aside, the biggest hurdle that has faced Mexican industry in recent years is reliable power supplies. The surge in shale gas into Mexico has already greatly mitigated that problem, and within a very few short years, Mexico's chronic rolling power outages will be a thing of the past. For manufacturers, whether Mexican or American, that removes one of Mexico's chronic limitations on industrial development. 3. Mexican demography generates a large market and a larger labor pool. Mexico also has a young population. Normally, this would be somewhat of a problem for a country at Mexico's stage of development. A capital-shy demographic combined with a capital-shy geography could forever trap Mexico in underdevelopment. In fact, that has been the trap Mexico has lived in ever since independence. But the positive aspects of a young population still apply. Mexico's young adults are hungry for goods and property. They just need paychecks. Luckily, their large number proportional to the overall population keeps their labor costs low and keeps foreign entities eager to invest in Mexico for goods production. While those investors may have initially been interested in selling those goods into the American market, there is every reason to service the local population as well. Doubly so since Mexico's lack of ability to self-industrialize means that internal goods supplies are so limited. In the early years, the Americans took brutal advantage of this with the Santa Fe Trail. American manufacturers were shipped to Santa Fe, a Mexican city, in order to build economic dependency upon the United States throughout the areas we now think of as the American Southwest. At the time the Americans founded the trail, Mexico was still an imperial Spanish territory. When the Mexican-American War occurred just 35 years later, most of the sparsely populated territory was so deeply within the American economic and cultural orbit that its inhabitants assisted the American war effort. The result was the capture of what is contemporary California, New Mexico, and Arizona and their transformation into American territories. If anything, Mexican demographics are even more favorable toward consumption than they look at first glance. Mexico's current demographic profile also shows a characteristic somewhat different from the normal pyramid. About 25 years ago, coinciding with higher labor participation rates brought upon by NAFTA, Mexican families started to shrink in size. Not so much that Mexico started to undergo the demographic collapse we are seeing in Europe, or even the tightening that the Americans are experiencing, but enough to turn the bottom portion of Mexico's population pyramid into a chimney. Population chimneys certainly pose long-term challenges, as they will in time lead to smaller and much older populations. But even if the rate of decline in Mexican birth rates continues unabated for another 3 decades, this will not be a financial problem for the Mexicans until 2050. Until then, the country has an ever larger proportion of its population in the critical 20 to 39-year-old age group. That's the people who are most likely to move around Mexico in order to secure work, who are most likely to attract foreign investment to generate exports for the American market, who are most likely to attract foreign investment seeking to satisfy the local market, and the cohort who are most likely to consume and so generate local growth. The mere existence of this group is sure to generate strong, sustained consumption and foreign direct investment-led growth across Mexico. The clipping of the pyramid's base, which means that Mexico has fewer children than in years past, has one other impact. It means that Mexico's young adults have greater amounts of disposable income. They are not raising as many kids, freeing up Mexico's young adults to spend just like the Europeans did during the 1990s and 2000s. However, since the inward investment reaching Mexico is foreign-directed and pouring into infrastructure and industrial plant rather than simple credit, the Mexicans will walk out on the other side of this process being richer and not being in debt, rather than simply feeling richer and being in debt like the Southern Europeans. Collectively, this makes Mexico one of only a handful of countries in an increasingly demographically inverted world that can still rely upon domestically driven growth and channel foreign capital in a productive manner. 4. The drug war has improved Mexico's economic prospects. It is something of a grim irony that the drug war is perhaps the best thing that has happened to Mexico from an economic point of view. Now that requires a bit of explanation. Bear in mind that it is the differential between Mexican and American labor costs that provides Mexico with economic opportunities that its geography would otherwise deny it. That differential is the Mexican economy's lifeblood. Nothing pushes down Mexican labor costs, increasing the differential, like a drug war raging throughout the country. In fact, the more violent the war, the lower Mexican labor costs, and so the greater the Mexican-American differential and the more attractive Mexico becomes to foreign direct investment seeking an advantage in the American market. Obviously, the war's security challenges pose any number of problems, but the drug war is not raging everywhere. Mexican drug violence is deep and endemic, but it follows the conflicts of the politics of the cartel wars. Violence is only the rule where the cartels find themselves competing for the same transport routes and choke points, such as the plazas where they can smuggle drugs across the border into the United States. Outside of those danger zones, Mexico is just another developing country, and far from being random, its dangers can be planned for and mitigated. So long as the drug war rages, the economics of integration with the American market only improve. Taken together, this mix of local and regional geographies and local and global demographics turns Mexico from a basket case to a near best case. Because of Mexico's proximity to the United States, it is typically one of the world's top destinations for foreign direct investment, FDI, enabling Mexico to sidestep the very capital problem that will soon be gutting the vast bulk of the developing world. Put together, Mexico is poised to be the fastest growing economy in the world for the next generation. Portfolio investors, in contrast, find Mexico a frustrating, frightening, and even outright disgusting place to operate, because the oligarchs' territoriality persists in the financial space. Oligarchs control their own banks, which finance their own projects in the regions they control. If they should find themselves willing to reach out for extra capital, they are far more likely to attempt to partner with a foreigner who would then be beholden to their political, economic, social, labor, and land connections than they would be to seek a loan from an institution run by another oligarch. As such, Mexico's stock markets are woefully underdeveloped, and in part because of the country's sharp left-right divide, overregulated. Barring changes that to date the Mexican system has proven unable to contemplate, much less initiate, the future of foreign involvement in Mexico will be the same as the past. Direct investments in physical plant, infrastructure, and labor, and very little involvement in Mexican stock markets, bond markets, or banks. The nature of the border. Americans think of the border with Mexico as wild, untamed, lawless, a drug-ridden, post-apocalyptic wasteland. Considering the inability of the Mexican government to patrol, much less control, its borderland, there is some truth to the American concerns. But that image of the border ignores the depth of the economic and cultural relationship between the two countries. Even before one considers that Mexico is about to experience economic breakout, Mexico's proximity to the United States has not only landed it with the status of one of the world's major economies, but is about to make it America's greatest ever economic partner. Consider the following. As of 2014, the United States exports to Mexico over 2 billion cubic feet of natural gas and nearly 1 million BPD of refined fuels, while Mexico ships 1 million BPD of crude north. By 2020, American shipments of natural gas will at least quadruple, making it the largest bilateral energy relationship in human history. As of 2013, some $510 billion in goods were exchanged across the border, making Mexico the Americans' third largest trading partner, second largest with services included. Bilateral trade will likely increase to $650 billion by 2020, making it rival US-Canada trade for the largest bilateral economic relationship in human history. As of 2014, some 350 million legal border crossings were made. This already makes the border the most crossed border in human history before considering illegal crossings. Projections indicate that legal crossings will hit 500 million annually by 2020. Mexican failure leads to integration with the United States. Poverty, government corruption, drug-related violence, environmental catastrophe, and weak infrastructure all increase internal Mexican labor mobility and decrease Mexican labor costs. The bigger the labor cost differential with the United States, the more economic integration between Mexico and the United States. American success leads to integration with Mexico. Wealth, transparent government, improved local security, higher labor and health standards, and strong infrastructure all increase American consumption and American labor costs. Again, the bigger the labor cost differential with Mexico, the more economic integration between Mexico and the United States. Acceptance of these facts changes the nature of the internal American debates about Mexico. The problem isn't so much that the Americans can't decide if they want to integrate with Mexico or not. The Americans are already integrated with Mexico. The issue is that they haven't decided how to manage the relationship. Side effects of that as yet unsettled relationship are an illegal immigrant community of about 7 million Mexicans and another 1.5 million Central Americans. The Central American states of Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Belize, and Costa Rica are in essence Mexico without the greater Mexico City region. City-states cursed with a territory that is impossible to develop. Panama would be the same if it were not for the canal and drug smuggling money, providing regular financial infusions into an otherwise worthless topography. Plus the tens of billions of dollars of drugs that are smuggled into the United States. With issues of this size, it is worth spending a little time discussing the nature of the border, mostly because most of the mooted solutions that exist in the American political arena are at best doomed to fail, with most of them being counterproductive. Let's leave aside the above arguments about robust economic interaction and the fact that cultural integration is already well underway, with roughly 1/9 to 1/6 of U.S. citizens, it depends who is doing the math, identifying themselves as having roots in Mexico. Let's ignore all the economic arguments about how Mexican immigrants, legal or otherwise, do jobs that Americans don't want, limit inflation, and serve very real and positive roles in the American labor market. Let's ignore the moral and legal implications of expunging the United States' illegal communities. Let's focus on the border itself. I've already said that Mexico, even in the best of times, cannot secure the border. Well, neither can the United States. The US-Mexico border is roughly 2,000 miles long. 2,000 miles sounds like a significant distance. It isn't significant. It's massive. That is double the length of the European Cold War border, a border that could only be sealed by turning the broader region into a national security zone under military rule. There has also been no small amount of talk of being tougher on immigration. This ignores basic human nature. The US government is far more capable than Mexico's. Somewhat ironically, the American capacity to deport large volumes of people is part of the structural and organizational strength that so draws immigrants. Although I think it is obvious that the specific act of deportation isn't something that would-be immigrants are all that fond of. Even stronger illegal migration penalties would not have much of an impact. Mexicans and Central Americans are fleeing not just poverty, but also the insecurity of the drug war and various Central American juntas. So unless US policy is going to be to shoot people on sight in the border zone, the Departments of Immigration and Homeland Security just aren't capable of counter-intimidation of anything like the environments the would-be immigrants are running from. So if the border cannot be sealed, if the allure of the United States cannot be dampened, and if policy failures in Mexico will only enhance integration, the United States is simply stuck with a large illegal Mexican and Central American community. Considering the lack of viable options in American public discourse, what does the presence of 8.5 million illegal Hispanic immigrants mean? Most have probably heard about the horrors of the Mexican drug wars, where kidnappings, assassinations, mass murders, public body dumpings, and beheadings are regrettably all too common. What is less understood is the link between illegal narcotics and illegal immigration. Because illegal immigrants are undocumented, they have difficulty gaining access to the basic pieces of modern society, including identification such as driver's licenses and financial access such as bank accounts. That has a far more damning impact than it may seem at first blush. With limited access to the banking system, illegals operate in the cash economy. They are far more likely to have significant quantities of cash on their person or in their home at any given time. Since illegals fear being discovered and deported, they often do not contact law enforcement when such inevitable attacks happen. In the modern age of credit cards and PayPal, that makes illegals a far more lucrative target for robbers and muggers than even rich Caucasians. There is a term for areas where people who live outside of normal social support networks exist: ghettos. Unique among American immigrant communities, Mexican and Central American illegals live in ghettos. This would be a serious social problem in need of addressing under any circumstance, but new circumstances have pushed it from the serious to the critical. The drug war of 2014 is considerably different from the drug war of the 20th century. Moving products is cheaper by water, regardless of whether the product is legal or not. As such, most interstate trade in illegal narcotics, just like interstate trade in any other product, originally traveled by water. In the United States, this made the port city of Miami the premier entry point for illegal narcotics. Small fleets of vessels would swarm from Colombia and Venezuela to Miami, and from there the drugs would percolate throughout the country. The 1980s hit TV show Miami Vice wasn't just a gripping drama, but was a little bit of geopolitics distilled into televised form. As a maritime power, however, maritime interception is something that the Americans are very good at. Once the Americans figured out what to look for, they were able to improve everything from port security to Coast Guard patrols, sharply limiting maritime and airborne shipments first into Miami, then all of Florida, and in time all coastal approaches. By the year 2000, maritime smuggling routes may not have been severed, but they had become so fraught with danger that they were no longer viable methods for transporting the bulk of the illicit narcotics the Americans so craved. As of 2014, Miami is still a major point of entry for South American cocaine. Most of it comes through Venezuela and up the Lesser Antilles chain to the Dominican Republic and Haiti before making the jump to Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory. But strong American and Cuban patrols, drug interdiction cooperation between the United States and Cuba is perhaps the highlight of the two countries' relations, prevent this flow from being more than small volumes smuggled in the holds of larger vessels or pleasure craft, resulting in much higher overhead costs and much lower volumes per shipment. This route is a faint shadow of what it used to be in its Miami Vice heyday. Long gone are the days where small vessels packed to the gills with cocaine could simply sail into Miami Harbor or land in or near the Everglades. Plenty of South American drugs are still shipped by water and air toward the United States, just not all the way to the United States. Most make landfall in Central America or southern Mexico before joining the cartel's landbound supply chains. But one of the quirks of narcotic economics is that the addicts at the point of sale are not particularly price sensitive. The American success at blocking maritime and air routes forced the drug flows into more expensive land routes. The sonar and low elevation radar that proved so effective at monitoring featureless water and keeping illicit shipments away from American shores proved largely useless at sealing the 2,000-mile-long U.S.-Mexican border. And so the drug flow shifted from Miami Vice to something else. One of the many reasons that water transport is so much cheaper is that it is so much less complicated. There are no middlemen in the ocean, no towns to navigate, no regulatory agencies that make their homes on the waves. You leave port, you sail, you can sail around anything you don't like the look of, you enter port, and that is it. On land, there are physical borders to cross. You must follow existing infrastructure. You must deal with local regulations, customs, and law enforcement at a plethora of stops along the way. But all this adds more than simply cost. It also ensures that the shippers become intimately involved in every aspect of their transport routes. And should shippers using two different routes find themselves operating at the same bottleneck, say a mountain valley where their routes merge or an international border crossing, competition erupts. In the case of Mexico and drugs, these features generate two results. First, they drive up the cost of the cocaine that ultimately reaches the United States. While drug smugglers aren't exactly sticklers for filing statistical data, the Department of Justice estimates that the Mexican land portion of the cocaine smuggling routes adds about $10,000 to the cost of a kilo of cocaine, about $10 a gram, as compared to 1980s seaborne routes. That is a lot of money being used to employ, corrupt, bribe, and or heavily arm a great many people across the length and breadth of Mexico's many smuggling byways. The landbound nature of the smuggling routes introduces so many increases to the price of cocaine that it is all but inevitable that large, well-funded organizations will arise from the trade. Best guess is that the Mexican portion of the drug supply chain has an annual turnover in excess of $60 billion, roughly 4 to 5% of Mexico's legal GDP. For comparison, the U.S. automotive industry comprises about 1.2% of U.S. GDP. The total sales of Walmart, America's largest corporation, are about 2.5%. Second, it also guarantees that these well-connected, well-funded organizations have a lot to fight over. We know that competition as the Mexican drug war or the cartel wars. It pits the various cartels against one another, battling for control of key nodes throughout northern and southern Mexico, up to and including the major border crossings to the United States. Not just the drug war, but the very existence of the cartels themselves would have been impossible if American success in blocking maritime drug shipments had not forced the drug flows inland. A generation after Miami Vice, the cartels are doing what any major corporation that controls neither the source nor destination of its product would do: diversify. First, diversify horizontally into similar industries in which their assets and skill sets are applicable. Things like robberies, cargo theft, and kidnappings are all now in the cartel's collective portfolio. Most notably, marijuana production and smuggling in Mexico were not part of most of the cartel's initial prerogatives. Now they are. Second, diversify up the supply chain to take over direct control of drug production. Third, and most relevant to this discussion, the cartels are expanding down the supply chain. Long ago, the cartels mastered the craft of border crossings. Now they have taken the next logical steps and are getting into retail distribution in the major American cocaine and marijuana distribution hubs. Obviously, border communities such as San Diego, El Paso, and Brownsville were the first targeted, but the cartels are also painfully active in places as far from the border as New York City. A particularly aggressive effort is even underway in British Columbia to seize control of the Canadian province's marijuana network from the Hells Angels. The cartels have also been very successful in utilizing American public lands, especially in the California state and national park system, to grow marijuana in large quantities closer to market. Wherever the cartels go, they come into competition with local American crime networks, oftentimes intercity gangs, for control of the local distribution systems. But while the premeditated violence of America's local inner-city gangs is no joke, it pales compared to the casual violence of the transnational drug groups that were forged in the culture of the Mexican cartel wars. Add in superior weapons, weapons training, and control over the actual supply of the narcotics, and the Mexicans are rapidly overwhelming and in some cases co-opting their former American sales affiliates. Finally, there is the illegal immigration nexus. The cartels have found in each major American city one additional, critical ingredient that has allowed them to put down roots deeper and spread faster than they could in South America or even among their own countrymen: America's Hispanic ghettos. The American method for managing its illegal population has created a large community in each major city that lives outside the protection of local law enforcement and financial monitoring. The cops' patrols are less effective without the illegals' active participation. The Fed has no bank data to work from. The illegals speak the same language and often come from the same country as the cartel's frontmen. It is a community setup that is perfect for the cartels to recruit from and ultimately control. As with the value of drugs, data as to the size of cartel penetration into the United States is somewhat limited, but the Department of Justice estimates that as of 2013, the cartels are already active in over 1,000 U.S. municipalities that include multitudes of communities in the greater Los Angeles, Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, Atlanta, Kansas City, Denver, Chicago, Detroit, and Baltimore metro regions. The cartel's expansion into the United States proper is still in its early stages, so at present their conflicts with American gangs are being swallowed up by the normal noise of gang-on-gang violence. But in the not-too-distant future, the cartels will have easily won those battles. And if the cartels are willing to go to war with each other for transport routes through Mexico, it is difficult to imagine that they'll pull punches when attempting to secure the cash cow of American demand from each other. The Mexican drug war has already expanded north of the border. It is no longer a question of prevention, but mitigation. I normally hesitate to suggest any courses of action. Geopolitical and demographic forces are so rooted in the unchangeable that political action often generates little but noise. But in this case, a course of action does present itself. Border security is, at best, a painfully expensive patch. The answer, I think, lies in legalization. Not of drugs, but of immigration. What studies I've examined indicate that legalizing illegal drugs is probably a financial wash. In most studies, any money saved in terms of law enforcement would most likely be lost in terms of higher healthcare costs and lost worker productivity. Additionally, most studies assume that a legal market for narcotics would eliminate the illegal market. Unfortunately, any legal regulated drug distribution system will have end costs higher than the black market, all but guaranteeing the black market's parallel existence, mitigating any cost savings. For soft drugs like marijuana, legalization might be a break-even proposition. But for hard drugs like cocaine, legalization would cause more problems, financial and otherwise, than it would solve. As regards the cartels, legalization provides some interesting possibilities. They battle each other over supplies and transport routes, and a legal supply and transport system is simply another source of competition to be addressed with their normal, brutal skill set. Colorado's and Washington's experiments with legalizing marijuana mean that they have volunteered to be case studies in a way I seriously doubt they have contemplated. Opening of the border with the issuance of worker and travel permits would with the speed of a printer transform America's Hispanic ghettos into areas where people have legitimate identification and store their money in banks. Cooperation with police would no longer be perceived as a sharp negative, and the Federal Reserve's anti-money laundering tools would suddenly have data to work with. Most of all, the cartels would lose their fertile rest and recruitment grounds north of the border. Legalization wouldn't solve everything, but it is the single biggest step that the United States could take. Should the Americans, however, choose to leave the border and the ghettos as is, they face the dawn of the most horrible conflict they have ever fought. Unlike Vietnam or Iraq, the next chapter of the drug war will be fought at home. More than China, more than Russia, more than Iran, it is expansion of the Mexican drug war to all of North America that is emerging as the single greatest geopolitical threat to the American way of life.